Environmental justice is a form, in my mind, of spatial justice that deals with differential environmental impacts according to where you live. And this has been brought to the surface by the environmental justice movement, that poor people generally, minorities generally in American cities, most often African Americans, but also others, tend to live compacted in areas where they just happen to be the largest number of hazardous waste centers, where the level of water pollution is higher than in most places, or the level of air pollution is higher than in most places. And so what we have here, the environmental justice movement in the courts, there's a lot of interesting intersections between space and legal studies these days, but the environmental justice movement in the courts has added discrimination by location to that long list: race, gender, class, sexual preference, etc., disability, age, all of that long list of particular discriminatory practices. We finally get added a spatial variable there, depending on where you live, is going to shape the reception of just distributions and effects. Not just from the environment, but of course from other decisions being made. So locational discrimination is another kind of example. I got carried away with sort of just trying to think. I did the other night, sitting, trying to go to sleep, thinking about examples to illustrate it, because I don't talk about, don't quite talk about it in this way, in a systematic listing way like this in the book. But here's another one that's very dear to my own regionalist heart, and that is injustice that comes from geographically uneven development. This can be done on different neighborhoods and areas of a city, or more often in different regions of a country. That some regions are going to be very advanced in their levels of development and other regions very much behind. This is also true of north-south, first world, third world relations as well, at a global scale. So there's a kind of global scale of spatial injustice that has to do with maldistributions of wealth and of opportunities and of income and so on. And it works also at a national scale, and it works also at a metropolitan scale. Now, this is where there's a lot of interesting theory going on, that geographically uneven development is almost inevitable. So some degree of inequality is always going to exist. But the question with regard to this particular example is, when do we feel we need to intervene? How great must the disparity be between regions, between neighborhoods, between parts of the world, before it is absolutely necessary to intervene? Of course, political positions are going to vary on this, but this becomes another interesting example, another way of looking at the notion of spatial justice. I've already sort of mentioned the next one on spatial prohibitions, but this is related to some interesting architectural questions in the past. What would a non-sexist, non-patriarchal city look like? It certainly is not the normal city. The normal city is built and shaped by male interests for male purposes on the whole. And this means that there's a kind of injustice that takes place with regard to gender. And it has to do with race, of course, and so on, with almost any other location, any other kind of key variable. And this becomes, in part a kind of, can be translated into a kind of question of design, recognizing that when you put your pen to paper to do designs, even for buildings, or certainly for larger scale clusters of buildings in urban design, that what you're doing is not politically innocent, that there's something built into the design process that is shaping space in particular ways. And it can be shaping space in ways that promote the advantage of one person type or group over another. I'm not saying you should be thinking of every single possibility of discriminatory practices when you're designing, because you'll never design, you'll be paralyzed. But at the other side, don't go to the point where you think that there's no implications of your design for these larger kinds of issues. Okay, straightforwardly maintaining public space. This is something that some who see spatial justice put at the focus. And of course, part of this is being stimulated today by the Arab Spring and the power that has come from public spaces like Tahrir Square and other public spaces in the Occupy movement, for example, that guaranteeing or trying to keep public space functioning as public space against enormous, increasing, intensely forms of privatization is also a form of struggling for spatial justice. Displacement of the poor by gentrification is sometimes too much the focus of the right to the city movement, that it becomes focused entirely on gentrification, because gentrification typically has this impact on displacing poor people out of the gentrified areas. And then I just left as a question mark, are gated communities fundamentally unjust spatially? And if so, what policy should we have towards gated communities? I don't have a very easy and clear answer for that. I just raise it as another part of thinking spatially about justice, equality, and fairness. Now, this is as important as anything I'm saying tonight. In order to really appreciate and understand what I mean by seeking spatial justice, it's necessary to have a particular way of thinking about space that is not widely adopted. Architecture is clearly one of the spatial disciplines, but its spatial thinking has certain qualities that don't fit what I'm talking about here. There's some richness in architecture, but much of it sees space only as material form. Right? And what I'm saying here is that we need a new spatial consciousness to understand and activate, if you want, the concept of spatial justice. And I try to do this in four key theses or steps or whatever, observations, to illustrate this different way of thinking about space. And it starts with something that seems so obvious today, but was a kind of radically new idea when it first came out from the pen of one of my favorite figures, Henri Lefebvre. By the way, he's very active in Montreal as well. And the notion is that the spaces that we're talking about, the spatiality we're talking about, is socially produced. It's not a given form, a material form only. And I don't want to say it's not, space doesn't have a material form. Of course it has a material form. But when we're talking about spatial justice, we're talking about socially produced space. Created, made human geographies. We make our geographies, our human geographies. And one of the first steps in this kind of thinking is to recognize that we make these geographies, these forms, we design them. An architect should be able to grasp that very easily, that urban space is socially produced, national spaces are socially produced, the global economy is socially produced, collectively produced. The right to the city idea that Lefebvre also initiated was based on the idea that our spaces were being socially produced by dominant forces that we don't have any control over. That the city was being shaped by forces beyond the control or even access of large portions of the population. And the right to the city was an attempt to mobilize populations to participate in a much greater and deeper way in this social production of space. So the first one is absolutely necessary to begin, and it has all kinds of repercussions as well, and it's a kind of Lefebvrean idea in many ways. The second one is a little more from Foucault, right? And that is to recognize that the geographies that we produce can be unjust and oppressive. The urban spaces we produce can do bad things to us, right? So this social production of space process is very politically charged. It can produce terrible things. It can increase domination, it can control people, it can people's lives, it can increase exploitation, misery, poverty, everything. And this was a major realization from Foucault. And it's an integral part of the first step, all right? Socially produced space. If you start saying, well, we make our geographies, but we often make them in ways that can have negative consequences, that can build in what one philosopher called structures of advantage and disadvantage into geographies. Structures that sort of maintain themselves and reproduce themselves by reproducing injustice, inequalities, unfair, unjust geographies. And so this is the second step in this new kind of consciousness. The third step is also vitally related to these two. If we produce this is why the production of space is so important, because if we produce them and it's not given by nature, Mother Nature is producing, no. God is not giving us these spaces, nor is it just some sort of neutral event that the earth gives us. We produce these spaces. We've been producing urban spaces for 12,000 years. And we've been creating problems through this social production of space through 12,000 years. And now we're becoming more aware of it than ever before. And so that's the idea here, that if we produce bad geographies, that's a simplistic way of describing it, we need to organize to change those geographies. We made them, we can change them. God made them, oh, well, I don't know. Mother Nature, well, you can't fool Mother Nature. But if we produce the geographies, a kind of second nature that we have produced, which is what happens when we first settle down and form urban settlements, as I say, 12,000 years ago. It's not a coincidence that Jane Jacobs is related to a lot of these thinkings and arguments. We need to organize to change these geographies for the better. The last point is a point that relates more specifically to struggle for spatial justice, and that is that looking at spatial justice and the need to organize to produce greater spatial justice provides a lot of extra benefits. One of the benefits is that it can link up social movements that had been very difficult to link up before. Feminist movements, labor movements, movements around sexual orientation, that these movements tend in the past to be very distinctive and channeled. But every one of them has a spatial aspect to their oppression and problems. And this spatial aspect is something that can be more easily shared. So people who are suffering from gender discrimination, people suffering from racial discrimination, from poverty and other kinds of forms of discrimination, locational, can find a kinship and hence lead to what I think is necessary today for any kind of social movement, and that is coalition building. The days when you can have a simple social movement around one issue, those days are gone. You're not going to be able to do it, whether it's community development or feminist issues, if only one issue. Today it's going to be much more difficult to be successful in any way. And so it becomes necessary to build not just coalitions around the same issue, but cross-cutting coalitions. And this is where the spatial thinking comes in most vividly. Okay. These are just a few observations that I used to start this imagination. One from Edward Said, who's one of the most creative and powerful spatial thinkers. He says that, all of us, I mean, this is part of the sort of power of these arguments. We can't avoid existing in a way that engages us in struggles over geography. That's life. We are spatial beings, and we're always involved in some degree, whether it's where you put your pants on in the morning. I'm not saying these are all urgent spatial issues, but you're always involved in some struggle that has to do with trying to shape your environment while your environment is shaping you. I once called that the socio-spatial dialectic. But I mean, it's fundamental to life that we're always existing socially and individually, trying to shape our environments, and at the same time our environment is trying to shape us, and we need to see it as a two-way street. Whereas most academics and geographers and others are very comfortable with seeing how social forces and processes shape forms, spatial forms and geographies. That's what they're specialized in, how capitalism shapes our built environment. Massively important work of David Harvey and others in Marxist geography. But the other way around, how our built environment shapes our politics, our class identities and relationships. Our politics is rarely studied. Geographers are particularly afraid of that. Oh my God, geographical determinism, we mustn't do that. But secretly, geographers and secretly architects too, really believe in some form of spatial determinism. I'm not sure that that's what I'm trying to promote, but we really need to be much more sophisticated about how the spaces we produce shape our behavior. Here again is another area that architects, I think, can contribute significantly. They have scale problems, architects. Architects have real problems thinking regionally, but they can go down to the body pretty well. They can go to a building pretty well, and they can go to clusters of buildings. That's about it, because then the rest of the world is clusters of buildings. And that's not the world that I know. But if you keep the scale at a micro level, the architects have a lot of things to say. Struggle over geographies. Again, justice cannot be seen independently from the urban condition. It's rooted in the urban condition, not just because, the statistic about most of us now live in cities, which is such a cliche these days. Everybody who talks about cities in the urban world can't resist saying, in 2007 the United Nations announced that the majority of the world's population lives in cities. No, much greater is the fact that in 2007, 70% of the wealth was concentrated in maybe 500 cities in the world, and that 85% of the innovation was concentrated in 40 cities. That these kinds of concentrations are astounding and unjust and worthy of being recognized to try to sort of encourage some change, but not just a simple statistic. But he says, above all, the city, and this has always been true, but it's perhaps more important to insist on this today, that the city condenses the many tensions and contradictions that infuse modern life. Here are my starting points for almost all of the work I do as a kind of assertive, critical spatial thinker, and that is, whatever your interests are, architecture, butterflies, it doesn't matter. Whatever your interests are, they can probably be significantly advanced by adopting a critical spatial perspective. You're going to find it sort of leading to new insights that you may not have been thinking about before. And then in particular, spatial thinking can not only enrich your understanding of almost any subject, and here was again the basis for shifting attention from just theory into the translation of theory into practice. It has the added potential to extend our practical knowledge into more effective actions aimed at changing the world for the better. I mean, these are my assertive arguments and beliefs, and they are behind what I have been doing for 30 more years. So that was the end of part one. Part two is reflecting a little bit of what I'm trying to do here, and my next book is going to be called My Los Angeles. And it's a kind of treatment of all of the work that I've been doing over the last 30 years on Los Angeles, bringing it up to date with seeking spatial justice and some other kinds of arguments. And again, you know, I've always been uncomfortable talking too much about Los Angeles because people get very offended by it. You know, what was it? One of the film, I think, I forget the name, was Will Smith and The End of the World. What so is it? But the film allegedly, when it had New York City being destroyed, the audience was quite calm and serious. But when Los Angeles was being destroyed, there were cheers in the audience. I'm not sure if this is true, but that's what the story goes. And because it's hard to talk about, but sometimes Los Angeles asserts itself so powerfully that you can't avoid recognizing it and trying to learn from it. And this starts with number one here, that seeking spatial justice through labor community coalition building has probably advanced further in Los Angeles than any other major U.S. metropolitan area. And this includes the right to the city movement, maybe not so much number one in the Occupy movement, but certainly up there in ways that are rarely recognized. And in terms of labor community coalition building, to do innovative things with spatial strategies, you know, that's my subset, if you will, Los Angeles has been extraordinary and has a base that it's achieved that is not really there in most other cities in the United States. I reserve this. I don't say Canada, I don't say North America. I know enough about Montreal to realize that I can't say that without doubt. So I need to know a lot more about Montreal before I can do that comparison. But certainly, just for our purposes here, that I think people in Montreal, no matter how advanced these are in Montreal, I think can learn something interesting from LA. Now, I'm going to go over this quickly now. Why this is true, why did this happen in LA? Well, part of it is because the restructuring process has been so dramatic. The change over the last 30 years has been enormous in LA. I mean, it's almost impossible to grasp how much LA has become a completely different kind of place over the last 30 or 40 years. But one of the features of what's been happening is a deepening of fundamental inequalities and injustice. So in a way, the geography of LA is more unjust than the geography of most other cities. So it's not surprising, perhaps, that social movements attempting to address inequality have emerged most thickly in LA. I also argue that the riots in 1992, which were not just simple race riots, but were very complicated global events, now called the justice riots, by the way, not a coincidence. The first day of the riots were in the streets were people carrying banners saying, "No justice, no peace." And this was the kind of real theme of what was happening, much more than, although it certainly was a kind of race riot as well, a racially motivated riot, but it was well more than this, cutting across all kinds of lines of class and gender and race and ethnicity and so on. And it stimulated a kind of growing recognition. This is one of the reasons that I think stimulated the intensity of the grassroots movements in Los Angeles, is that after 1992, people suddenly realized that the government is not going to be able, no matter what government we're talking about, local, state, provincial, national, federal government, they're not going to deal. The problems are so enormous. The inequality is so great. The United Nations after 1992 said what happened in Los Angeles is part of a kind of politics that's going to spread around the world about urban poverty. And partly it's coming from the fact that inequality in the United States is the greatest economic inequality, the greatest ever in American history, and greater than any other industrial country. But the most unequal city or place is Los Angeles, and New York, they say. But Los Angeles, they say, has inequalities that are now comparable to Karachi, Calcutta, Mexico City, and so on. And so in some ways, it's not surprising that this happened. Another factor in this was that there was a kind of political dampening that came from this realization. A lot of very progressive people on the left, were accustomed to fighting the state and demanding more from the state. And then they began to realize the state's not going to help you. And so many good lefties left politics because you could enjoy Los Angeles on another level if you get out of the political realm, enjoy the beaches and the skiing and so on. And there was a lot of lost political vigor in Los Angeles after '92. But at the same time, the poor, the largest agglomeration of the immigrant working poor in any city on earth is now in the center of Los Angeles. 5 million people, perhaps, from every developing country in the world, now clustered together in a large-scale agglomeration that New York is much more fragmented, London is much more fragmented, Paris, but in Los Angeles it's very much more cohesive in many ways. And from it are coming new ideas. The big comparison I make is with Manchester in the 19th century, where, as Engels found out, or suggested, that the agglomeration of the poor and the proletariat in Manchester was going to generate new ideas about radical labor movements. And indeed, that's what happened out of Manchester. The Labour Party and the labor movement in Britain was stimulated most by events coming out of, and forces coming out of Manchester. And so again, we have some of these grassroots forces coming from Los Angeles and their particular extraordinary population, demography, and geography. And here gets my spatial geography plugs in again. Distinguishing these movements in LA from their counterparts elsewhere is the fact that they are much more spatially conscious, according to the way I defined it, in that pragmatic and new way, than are social movements in other major metropolitan areas. This is one of the questions I would have about Montreal, how explicitly spatially conscious. Yes, all of these movements are spatial because everything can be made spatial. But is there an explicit spatial consciousness? Let's use spatial strategies and so on. I would like to find out, because this is what I think was happening in LA. And hence it becomes a center for specifically seeking spatial justice. University connections, well, I have a big thing about the urban planning department playing a key role in all of these developments. Geographers and planners and some architects becoming deeply involved in these social movements and playing a vital role in most of them, not all of them. But I won't want to dwell on that, because I just want to give some examples, and the main one I want to talk about is the Bus Riders Union, because we don't have too much time. But these are the three major ones that are now lapping over into a kind of strengthened Occupy movement as well, which is I'm trying to study, but I didn't write about in the book, of course, because it was happening afterwards. But I want to take some time with the Bus Riders Union. The Bus Riders Union was an organization coming out of a very remarkable and unusually radical organizing center called the Labor Community Strategy Center, run by a couple. He is one of the major labor leaders in the past for the automobile union, fought against the closure of the automobile plants in LA and has been a major organizing anti-racist figure in the United States. And his wife is an architect, a critical architect. And so you can see an architectural spatial mentality inculcated into the whole bus riders union. Now, the bus riders union was an organization of what the strategy center called the transit-dependent population. It was a brilliant spin, a brilliant term. The population in Los Angeles, which is probably getting on to 1 million people, who were so poor that they could not afford to run a car with the insurance and everything, and so they had to depend entirely on public transit. The only alternative to the struggle I'm going to talk about, they say, was to give them all free cars. That was one serious solution that was suggested. But instead, what happened is that they brought the Metropolitan Transit Authority to court. The MTA was in the midst of a massive $30 billion fixed rail project, and the idiots at the MTA decided to raise the fares of buses. This meant that this million poor people, the transit-dependent population, were going to suffer from the rail building. And so they went to court and sued the Metropolitan Transit Authority on a civil rights case, claiming discriminatory practices by overemphasizing the rail versus the bus system. And basically made the argument that there was an injustice built in to the, not just the differential investment between rail and bus, but into the very nature of the proposed rail system, which was a very traditional rail system going from the center of Los Angeles outward to the suburbs and like spokes of a wheel, which had almost no benefit to the core poor population who have multi-locational jobs. They need to go Monday here, Tuesday here, and go around in very complicated paths in their employment. And, you know, the idea of just one line that goes out to Beverly Hills and Glendale and the Valley or whatever is not going to help them very much. So it was not just a lawsuit based upon investment discrimination, which, by the way, has great depth in the whole of the emphasis on automobiles. Lion's share of all investment has always gone to automobile rather than rail and public transit. But that was another story. So they sued and they won the case. Now, this is completely against the hardline left Marxist interpretations that David Harvey, that the normal workings of an urban system always lead to the redistribution of real income from the poor to the rich. Yeah, 95% of the time that probably happens. Public policy decisions and so on. Not only public policy, but shopping centers decisions and groceries, where to locate and so on. All of those spatial things I talked about would tend to benefit the wealthy, like Westmount got to address what was a very democratic regional process going on in Montreal, to sort of break it open again to their favor. You know, why did this? Well, that's another story. But you know, this is part of the process, and they forced the MTA to put bus system improvements at the top of their list and budget. They had to, as part of the agreement, the court order, they had to buy a large number of environment-friendly buses. Los Angeles now has the largest environmental-friendly bus system in the United States. They had to deal with scheduling and crime at bus stops, investing massive amounts of money in research and action on these things. Los Angeles now has developed a kind of switching system that every other American city is copying. a kind of innovative idea. And indeed, billions of dollars, not the 30 billion, but billions of dollars have shifted from a rail plan that would have helped the poor, but would have helped the rich much more, to a bus plan that helps the rich a little bit, but helps the poor much more. A very unusual event, also for its magnitude in terms of the amount of money involved. Between billions for buses is the theme of a book that the organizer is writing now. But this is, it opened up a precedent that would be, I guess, revolutionary in the United States. If it was possible to allow the bus riders union case, or the Labor Community Strategy Center versus the Metropolitan Transit Authority of Los Angeles, if that case's precedent could have expanded to other places, just think what could have happened. Every plan made in every city would have to be subjected to a spatial justice test. Does this plan discriminate against the needs of the poor in favor of a group that doesn't have that immediate need? And if it does, throw it out. Now, that could have really created absolute chaos in every bit of the planning process. You want to close down hospitals? We can show you that this is deeply unjust for poor people, because the ones you're closing are most accessible to the poor. The ones you're leaving open are comfortable for the wealthy. They don't need it. So your geography is unjust, the geography of your plan. And you can do this for decisions on education, on transit, on housing, on everything. Well, if it weren't for the Gulf-Iraq war, I'm sure the Bush presidency would have crushed this earlier. But it took a few years until 2001, when our dear Supreme Court, in its usual 5-4 ultra-conservative decision, in a case that they, I'm sure, made up. It was a Mexican in Alabama who decided that he should be taking his Department of Motor Vehicle test in Spanish, and that it was discriminatory not to give it to him in Spanish. This went to the Supreme Court and just invited the Supreme Court to just crush the bus riders union case. And this is what they did in a decision called Sandoval versus State of Alabama or something. And not only it was Scalia as the major spokesperson, who was the most evil of all of them, on a par almost with Karl Rove, but that's another story too. But what he said was how the Supreme Court literally stopped the civil rights movement. The first statement was, well, you can't do this unless you can show the public authorities intended to discriminate. That is, for the civil rights movement, you had to prove that governments and so on, the courts, said, oh, let's get those black people and prove that before you can prove discrimination. So that was enough. That could almost shut the bus riders union case. But then Scalia was very happy to go on further and made an announcement from the Supreme Court that the organizing world today is only beginning to realize the impact of, and this was back to 2001. He said, no independent private organization or authority or individual can sue any government agency on discrepancy and discriminatory practices, period. No one can sue any government agency on discriminatory practices. This was what the Supreme Court said in 2001. And as you can imagine, that certainly crushed the bus riders union spread. In 2006, because it was a 10-year agreement, 2006, the agreement went out of effect. And since then, the MTA has viciously been destroying the bus system, trying to destroy what was also building up as the best bus system in the United States. They've cut out something close to 900,000, something like that, 9,000 miles of bus routes. They're increasing prices. And the Bus Riders Union, which still exists, is actively out there fighting like mad. Right now, in fact, this week, there's a major demonstration going on because the federal government did a special survey of the MTA and of transit in Los Angeles and came out saying that they violate in many, many vicious ways all civil rights. I mean, terrible discriminatory practices, the worst they've seen in the United States. And nothing happened. They sort of buried it in LA. And so the Bus Riders Union is out there in the streets trying to say, listen, we just have evidence that they're doing this. We have to fight against what they have been doing since. So the Bus Riders Union is not dead, but it's certainly different from what it was when this case was in force. As you can see, there's a very strong Korean participation. Here it is in Spanish as well as in Korean. A very strong Korean activism in LA, Korean workers. Sandoval, Alexander versus Sandoval is what I was talking about in 2001. And good old Los Angeles, you can do most of these examples. You can teach a course based on your videos and DVDs. There's a Bus Riders Union film. There's a Justice for Janitors film. The Bus Riders Union film by Haskell Wexler, a very prominent, very progressive director and producer in the United States, in Hollywood, on the Bus Riders Union. He spent something like 3 or 4 years with it. This was a background to the movement. Justice for Janitors could have started it, and they were successful in Jobs with Justice, a living wage campaign. I don't have time for all of this. I just want to briefly mention what's at the bottom, the Los Angeles Alliance for a New Economy, which is another one of these very important organizations. These are the Justice for Janitors people with their demonstration in Century City in Los Angeles. Very strategic demonstration, knowing when to provoke the police to violence so that it'll be on the evening news. And they could sue the city successfully, which is what they did. Remember 1990, June 17th was the time of this demonstration. It's now celebrated as Workers' Day around the world. I don't know if you recognize it here, June 17th. Here's another picture. They do a lot of work with part-time, with day workers, temporary workers, justice for them. Again, the word justice is there all the time. Here's some of their examples. Again, Service Employees Union. And Bread and Roses by the well-known British director Ken Loach is on a bilingual film on Justice for Janitors. And this new group, which came out from a lot of university ties, this group, Los Angeles Alliance for a New Economy, has hired something like 40 of our students from urban planning over the years in every kind of position, research and so on, everything. And so what does this do? This is, remember I said one of the special things about LA was this two-way flow, an intense flow between the university and the community. And part of it is that the students carry the stuff that they learn in courses, all kinds of courses, into the community. And we have a community scholars program which brings leaders from the community into our department to take any course that they want. It was a very successful and very important program that facilitated some very interesting two-way flows here. Lane is important for two things. One, it led a fight, really the most successful fight against Walmart superstores. I'm sure many of you are aware of these kind of struggles, but how they did it to, again, like the Justice for Janitors movement, which was begun because researchers in urban planning went out and showed that janitors were getting lower pay in Los Angeles than janitors in New York and Chicago and downtown San Francisco. And this spurred the movement. what happened with the anti-Walmart campaign is they discovered something really wonderful and wild. And that was the reason why Walmart can charge low prices is that they pay their workers so little that the workers can only survive by going on welfare and food stamps. And so they discovered that the amount of savings that you would get from the low prices at Walmart was less than the taxes spent for the welfare of the workers that Walmart hired. And so there was also a film here called, The High Cost of Low Prices, another DVD. But the other thing that is also happening from Lane is something called community benefits agreements. I don't know if you know about business district things in the U.S., organizations fostering business and investment. This is one of the few fostering neighborhoods. In L.A., and there are about 80 projects of this, lots of projects already. In L.A., any developer who would like to invest in whatever, Universal City, big buildings, big shopping centers, would not be stopped, but they would be forced into what is called development with justice. That they are legally required to negotiate with local, and they're called local coalitions, to obtain an agreement for spending money to improve social benefits in the area in return for smoothing the licensing and other processes going on for the developer. So it's not stop development, but forcing a kind of concern development, a kind of more just development. And this is being spread throughout the United States. It's more successful in LA because of the foundations it's building on. So I gave this lecture at Harvard, at GSD actually, and one of the organizers in Boston came up and said these community benefit agreements really don't work in Boston. And I said, why? He said, because the developers, we don't have those local coalitions, and so the developers go out and pay some people to form a local coalition, and then negotiate with their puppets, and nothing happens. But in LA, that won't happen. Okay, so that's the end. The last one is the Right to City Alliance, which, unlike what David Harvey says in his new book, didn't start really first in Atlanta. It started in LA, with attention being given to Lefebvre, which he says didn't happen. It did happen. And it's been now growing all over the US, and I'm not sure if there are alliances that spread into Canada now. I know there's a Right to the City movement in Montreal. It's, to me, the carrying forward of the whole idea of seeking spatial justice. Here's just a bit of background. One of the things that came out of this is something called community-based regionalism. It's another form of coalition building I just worthwhile mentioning, because I'm very much ending this now. And I'm saying, is there a link to the Occupy movement, Montreal connections, ? I've just been told about the red box graffiti because I'm doing an analysis of how graffiti artists are interacting with the Occupy movement in Los Angeles. And so there's a lot for me to learn about Montreal. And so summarizing, these are just the arguments I've been making. Justice and justice are infused into the multi-scalar geographies from the body to the global economy. Social justice and injustice are concretized in space, in unjust geographies. And these unjust geographies can be changed through social action and political action. And there's the ending, a challenge to the city building professions, all of you. Architects, designers, planners, urban and regional planners, on how to deal with the unjust geographies that we live in. Thank you.
Psychogeography and like the concept of mental maps and people kind of projecting, having their own kind of idea of the way geography works and their own space. How do you think this fits into, I mean, when you talk about creating a sort of a just geography for people, people are going to interpret that differently based on where they go. Is there any, should that be taken into account? How can you deal with that?
Well, yeah, I mean, you're identifying an area that's very interesting, but it's not quite as developed as some of the other parts of geography that work on mental maps. But yeah, the way we perceive the world, we all carry mental maps in our brain, in our heads, and they shape a lot of what happens. And indeed, it becomes a target for organizing to try to open up those mental maps to another level of political sophistication, to become more aware individually and personally of the injustice of these geographies. And we have mental maps, and we test them as geographers to make people draw maps of wherever they live and whatever. But I think we can target this and incorporate this, like all of GIS, if you will. People think my politics make me against GIS, but I think GIS could be made very, very useful as almost any other kind of geography in this. So, this is just one of many kind of possibilities. But again, the key point is how to make people aware of the injustices of geography, not just with regard to them personally, but on a larger social scene as well.
Hi, thanks. What do you think about things like the city repair project in Portland?
The city of?
The city repair project, it's shutting down intersections to make community spaces. And
I don't know very much about what the Portland situation. I have a little bias about the Portland situation, sort of bragging about its regional planning and governance, but it's probably as much of a sprawling suburbia as anywhere else. But yeah, I think the core of Portland is a place with some very innovative ideas. I don't think they've explicitly attached themselves to either the environmental justice or certainly the spatial justice kind of right to the city movement. I may be wrong, maybe they have, but I don't know enough about it to sort of do anything other than say that it doesn't surprise me that Portland is generating some interesting ideas. But again,